So we started this unit with an example of how to pick the degree of a polynomial in polynomial fitting. And that was related to a more general problem of what we called model order selection. And then we took a pretty long detour, if you like, and talked about the general theory about the way we could think about the trade-offs in model order selection. And that led us to two important mathematical concepts called bias and variance, and related problems of underfitting and overfitting. There's another section about computing the bias and variance in some linear models. I'm going to skip a video on that, but check it out if you want to hear more. But what I want to do in this final section is give you a very simple, practical approach to picking models that brings this idea of bias and variance theory in practice. And this idea is called cross-validation, and it's pretty much used in absolutely every machine learning task you're going to do. So if there's one lesson from our bias and variance theory, was that what we need to do is evaluate our model somehow on samples that are different than the ones that we trained it on. We need, from a statistical standpoint, independent samples. Now the question then is, how do you get those samples? Because indeed we only have one data set. And the idea of cross-validation is very, very simple. So suppose you have some data, X and Y. Basic and very simple idea is you just split the data into two parts. Split it into n trained samples for training, and then the remainder for test. And we'll call those two batches X train, Y train, and X test, Y test. And I'll show you how to do this in Python super easy. Now, suppose you don't know the model order, like a polynomial fitting. I'm going to loop over every possible model order, like the degree of the polynomial or whatever that model order is. And what I do first is I fit the model order, but I fit it only on the training set for each model order. So I just made up some sort of pseudocode or fictitious syntax, if you like. I have a fit function which takes the training data and the model order, and it produces a set of parameters, like the polynomial coefficients. Now, here's a trick. Instead of evaluating it on the training data, we now evaluate it on the test data. So I take my estimated parameter and I predict on the training data what the labels for that data would be. And I'll call that y hat test. And then I score that value, meaning like let's say the RSS or whatever measure of prediction error, relative to what the training data values were, as opposed to what on the test values were, as opposed to the training data. Now I have this score on the test data for every possible model order. And since this test data is independent of the training data, it should be a pretty accurate estimate of how well that model is doing on new samples. So what I do is just simply pick the model order that has the minimum test score. Of course, if you're picking a metric where the higher score is better, you pick the one with the highest test score. But that's the basic idea. Now what I'm going to show you how to do, that was pseudocode. I'm going to now walk you through Python and just show you how to do this super easy in the polynomial example. Okay, so let's go back to the demo on the GitHub site to show you how to do cross-validation in sklearn, and it's super easy. So again, I've just pulled up that demo on the colab.research.google site, as was done in the first section, and I scroll down to this part using cross-validation. So the first step in cross-validation is to split your data into two parts. So what if remember we have n sample points, and I'm just going to split them into two equal parts. 50% for training and 50% for test. And then we just use this Python syntax here to grab the first n train components for training and all the remaining components for test. So let's just run that. Just to see what that, the size of what we're looking at. If we look at the size of the training set, it's 50 components, and if I look at the test set, it is also 50 components. And you'd get the same thing if you looked at Y-train and Y-test. All right, before we go on, just let's plot here the red line against the true function, and you can see here the blue dots, are the training data points, those blue circles, and the green squares are the training. So you've kind of divided it like this. So we're going to train on the blue dots and we're going to test on the green dots. All right. If you don't want to manually do this training and test split, actually sklearn has a very nice routine, built-in routine, which you can run like this to do training and test splitting, since you have to do this all the time. And you really just call train test split. You give it the data you want to split and the fraction of the time of the samples you want for test, and it splits it into these four amounts. If I just do this again, just to look at this, xtrain.shape and xtest.shape. And again, they're both 50 as you would expect. Okay, there's one other benefit for the train test split. If you run this, it actually also shuffles the data. All right, now that you've done the training and test splitting, cross-validation is very easy. I've given the pseudocode here, but let's just look at the actual code. I'm going to range over some values of the polynomial order from 0 to 10 in this case. And for each value, I'm going to fit the data on the training. That's this line here. I'm also going to, just out of curiosity, I'm going to measure the training data mean squared error with this. But this is just for visualization. We don't actually use this. So I take the estimated parameter, I predict it on the training data set and measure the training error. But what's actually important is to take the measured parameter and predict it on the test data set and then score it or measure the mean squared error on the test data set. And then I just plot the training and test error as a function of the model order. So let's just run this. That's very, very fast. And what you see here is that the training error, as you recall, always goes down. That always happens. That's the blue line. But the test error goes down until about 3, and then it starts to go back up again because you're actually overfitting the data. It doesn't go up that much in this case. And in fact, it can go down again a little bit. Depends on there'll be some randomness in the program because of the data. Now, if I then go to say I'm going to pick the cross-validation says I'm going to pick the model order that has the lowest test error. I just do that with this argmin function. Find the index, which has the lowest model order. And then it says here that the estimated model order is 3 because that is the one here that is the lowest. Okay, there are some problems though with this very simple train test procedure. The first part is that the test error could vary significantly depending on how you split the training and test. So if you pick certain samples for test, you might, and the other samples for training, you might get a low test error, but if you pick different ones, you could get a high test error. And the second point is that when you have a very limited amount of data, you're restricting the number of samples that you can use for training. And as we saw earlier, that will increase the variance error in the training. And so both of these problems are particularly bad whenever you have a limited number of samples. So you want to somehow try to use your samples more judiciously. The most common way to do that whenever you have limited amount of data is to use what's called k-fold cross-validation. And I've just taken this picture from this nice blog here. Now, this is the idea. What you do is you have your data, but instead of breaking it into 2 parts, you break it into k parts. Usually k is like 5 or 10, and in this picture it's 5. So in the first time, in each part, it's called a fold. In the first pass, you train on 4 of them and then test on the remaining 1. So that's very good for training because you're using 80% of your data for training. But the test is not that accurate because you're only testing it on 20% of the data. But to get around that, the next pass you take a different 4 points for training, different 4 folds for training and test on the second one, and keep on repeating like this. And after you've gone through 5 folds, you will have trained on each part 4 times and tested on it once. And you'll get 5 test scores. And then you can take the average across these test scores to come up with your overall average. Okay, let's look at how you do this in Python. It's also very easy. Okay, continuing with the demo, I'm going to scroll down to the k-fold validation part. And to do k-fold validation in Python, it's very easy because the sklearn package has some very nice routines to do most of the grunt work for you. So what you do, the first thing is you import this very nice little sub package, actually on model selection. And then this is the code. It's, this is the whole length. It's not that hard. What you do is you say the number of folds you want. So let's just say 10. Usually it's either 5 or 10. And you create a k-fold object with the number of splits. And I just turn the shuffling on. So it shuffles the data to get some more randomness. And then just as before, we loop over the number of different possible model orders. And we use this as the loop structure here. So for every fold or every pass through the data, I'm going to get indices for the training and test in that fold. And I'm just going to grab the training and test data in that particular fold. And then in that fold, I'm going to loop over all possible model orders. I'm going to fit the data for each of those model orders. And then I'm going to measure the mean squared error on those model orders and then put them into an array, which the array will have for each of the iterations for each of the model orders. Let's actually just run this. Maybe it'll be clearer when I look at this. If I look now at the shape, it just ran very quickly. If I just print here, the shape of this, you can see here that this is a 10 by 10 array. The 10 here is because there are 10 model orders that I'm going over, and the 10 across this direction are the 10 different folds, right? So if there were 5 folds, it would be a 10 by 5 array. Now what I do is I can compute the average. For each model order, I compute the average across the folds. So that's this mean command here, and I say the axis is 1 to take the mean across the folds. And similarly, I can take the standard deviation. And what's important is what's called a standard error, which I'll explain momentarily. And that is where you just divide this by the square root of the number of folds. So you have the mean and the standard error across the folds. And then I can just print or plot that average value like this with this error bars. So here we see the solid line is the average value. It does go down, and then it's a little hard to tell, but it starts slowly actually going up. You also see here these little error bars in this case, and the error bars are just that the width of that standard error. All right, now, but what you can see here is that if you recall from the previous time when we looked at only one fold, this was actually pretty erratic, bumpy line, but it's much smoother in this case. Now I can just find the minimum of this to find our new model order, which is the model order where this is where the average value is at its smallest. That's just same argument function, and now it does show that it's 3. Okay, so what we just saw was that when you're doing k-fold validation, you take the average score, let's say the RSS, you average it across all the folds, and then you select the model order which provides the lowest average. Now, one problem with this is that it sometimes might slightly over-predict the model order, because you can get a situation like we had here, that the lowest is 3, but is not that much higher the average test error on model order 4 or 5 or 6. It's only going up very slowly. So if there was a little bit more randomness in the data, you could actually slightly over-select the model order. To get around this, you want to tend to be a little more conservative in selecting high model orders. You use something called the one standard error rule, which is you pick the model order that gives you the lowest error within one standard error. Now, what does that mean mathematically? It's just this is in pseudocode. You get your data, x and y, as before. And then for each model order and fold, you compute a score. This is just like we did before. So that could be, say, the RSS or whatever it is. And I'm going to compute 3 quantities. I'm going to compute the average score across the different folds. So I'm going to take that average here across the folds, and then for each model order P, I have this average score. I'm also going to compute the variance across the folds, and then I'm going to compute that standard error, which is dividing the standard deviation by the square root of the number of folds. Now, what I would have done before is what's called the normal rule. I would have picked the model order that has the minimum average score across the folds. That's just minimizing this S bar. But if you want to be a little more conservative, and you often do, you should do the following, which is a computer target value which is a little higher than that score, which is the average value plus the standard error at that model order. And then, and this is just the mathematical lingo here, to say I'm just going to pick the model order, the smallest model order that gets me an average value that's within this target here. And if you go to the GitHub site, you can walk through some code which shows you how to do this, as well as some problems in the homework. Let me just briefly talk about the lab, which I think is a pretty interesting application of these concepts. So this is data from a very great website which has a lot of neurological data sets, and you can use these, say, for your project. So in this particular one, there's a monkey, and the monkey actually has an electrode array attached to its brain, and it's reading neural signals from the monkey, and they're being recorded. So there are a number of neurons, I think about 196, that are being measured, and they're being measured over time. And each of these neurons, the way that the signaling works, they spike at different times, and they're recorded. At the same time, the monkey is doing what I call reaching tasks, and it's moving its arms around some area, and the velocity and position of the hand is being recorded. And what we want to see is if we could actually look at these neural signals and figure out the x and y velocity from these neural signals. In other words, we're kind of reading the monkey's brain. So that's pretty exciting. And what you're going to do in this is, I want to go through all the details right here, but I'm going to make a prediction of the velocity based on the neural signals at the current time plus some previous values of time. Because obviously there's a time lag between the time that the neurons fire in the brain, in the what's called motor cortex, to the time they actually arrive at the and create a velocity change in the arm. And the more time delay I have, the more complex a model I have, because I'm allowing more time steps in that model. On the other hand, there's a possibility that I might overfit. And this lab, you're going to try to pick that optimal amount or number of time lags using model order selection. So go ahead, try the problems, try the labs, and should hopefully try out what you've learned in this unit.